Les voy a pedir si pueden ir tomando asiento para empezar, que ya son las 12. I'm going to give you both 1 minute to give an initial statement, and I will begin with them, and then I will begin with the questions. Okay? Yeah. Hello. Okay, so hello, good morning. My name is Javier Rubio. Welcome to this roundtable discussion. It's my great pleasure to present our two guests today, Professor Stefano Zamagni and Professor Michael Schuck. First and foremost, I must say that these are no ordinary guests. Professor Zamagni is not only a great friend of this university, but he is also a member of the jury of this year's Expanded Reason Awards. And Professor Michael Schuck is one of the winners of the first edition of these awards with a work in the teaching category, Healing Earth, with his colleagues Nancy Tuchman and Michael Garanzini. Both of them have big curricula. Stefano Zamagni is a professor of political economy at the University of Bologna and one of the main exponents of the current of thought known as civil economy. He is also a member of the Human Development and Capability Association and president of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. He is also the vice director of Johns Hopkins University, Campus Bologna. On the other way, Michael Schuck is a professor in the Department of Theology and the Institute of Environmental Sustainability at Loyola University, Chicago. He is also co-director of the International Jesuit Ecological Project. In addition to environmental ethics, Michael teaches and researches areas of Catholic thought, theology, and ethics of philosophy, religious ethics, and social theory. Michael was the founding director of the Hank Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage at Loyola University. So, our topic today, this morning, is the role of the humanities in university life. In particular, in the way that the humanities relates to other fields of knowledge. We need to have in mind that when we speak about the humanities' role in the university, we are mostly referring to an engagement of any field of knowledge with philosophical anthropology and epistemology. So, to begin, I will give a minute to each of our guests for an initial statement, and then we will begin with our questions. So, please, Professor Michael.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Joseph Ratzinger Foundation and to all of the administrators and staff of the Expanded Reason Award and for the Francisco Vitoria University for inviting me back. I'm extremely grateful. The award that I received with Dr. Tuchman and Father Garanzini in 2017 was very meaningful to us. So much so that I still wear the hat that I wore when we met the Pope in Rome, and it needs cleaning. I do want to start with the recognition of the hundreds of thousands of young people that today are really putting their bodies out in demonstration of the humanistic requirements that really we have to bring to bear on the climate change. When we talk about humanism and environment, these are human beings that are putting their bodies, and I'm so impressed with that, and I pray for their safety today around the world, and for my own students who are traveling to New York. Well, they traveled yesterday. Our intellectual challenges in addressing the confinement of reason within the categories of the conventional academy are large, huge, and I couldn't say a word to improve upon the wonderful lecture we had yesterday by Dr. Greg. It was, I thought, incredible, very good. As someone who did his graduate degree, first degree in social science, and then in theology, and now teaching in a natural science program, I'm in the middle of this vortex of humanities and sciences, social and natural, and it's kind of vertiginous. But it's a wonderful place to be, and I think I have as an old professor now, I feel like I have a foot into the future. My students are in this same place. They're in this vertiginous place of the natural social sciences and the humanities and trying to find their own integrity. I've had so many students ask me how they can bring together their spiritual lives, their ethical lives with their knowledge and science. And we're really doing that together, or attempting to do that together. I just wanted to mention briefly that each time I teach my environmental ethics class in the Institute for Environmental Sustainability, and most of these are environmental science students, on the evaluations of the class at the end, it's very frequent that students say, I was very interested in the spirituality component of environmental studies. So I think there's a great hunger there. Our students are hungry for the humanities, and we're in a privileged place to put great thought behind that. So I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have this morning. My tendency will be to be very practical, to explore some of the practical things that are being done in general that I'm aware of in the United States and also at Loyola in addressing the integrity of knowledge and the attempt to bring humanities to a fuller reality in our pedagogy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Zamagni, would you like to give us a first statement?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind invitation that the University Francisco de Vitoria made. And congratulations for having organized this expanded Reason Congress. And the topic for which we are supposed to talk about is of central importance today. I am an economist. As a consequence, I belong to the realm of social sciences. But let me start from a general statement. I do believe that the role of humanities, in particularly today, are foundational to the question posed by other sciences, and this in particular to the question posed by social sciences such as economics. So I don't agree with those who say humanities are like an ornament or a complement. In my opinion, they are foundational. Now, how do I justify that? As we know, the story started some time ago with the thesis of the great division, facts and values. Facts is the domain of sciences, the hard sciences, and values is the domain of humanities, in particular of philosophy. Now, we know that today that distinction, that division does not hold any longer. That is why we observe in many different ways, from different, let's say, angles of a necessity to recollect and to take again the discourse, the dialogue on the issue we are talking about. In particular, this is true because, as certainly you will know, Chris Anderson, the founder of the well-known magazine which is called Wired, exactly 10 years ago, to be precise, 2008, he published an article whose title is revealing. The title is The End of Theory. He says, the new technologies in artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., today are substituting the concept of correlation to the concept of causation. Now, science has always been based on the principle of causation. Phenomena are the effect of certain causes, and the scientist is supposed to search for the causes. Now, in this article, Anderson says today that is no longer required because using big data and many other things, we are capable of establishing correlation and not causation among phenomena which are more than enough to allow us to understand how the world is working and how we should proceed. Now, this is a challenge. I'm sure that he himself does not believe, but still is a challenge which should be taken into consideration. My point is that if we want to maintain the realm of scientific endeavor to the search of causes, we need, it's a necessity to have foundations in the humanities field. And that is why it is proper to, of course, this is a statement. I would need to demonstrate such a statement. And perhaps I will do that later if there is another question with specific reference to my discipline with economics. I have the pretension to state that today economics is among the social sciences the most advanced in the following sense. That is the science that more than other social sciences recognizes its limits and its profound aporias. In other words, holes in the economic discourse. And that is why we should insist in this direction, because a new paradigm, in my opinion, is in front of us, and it is possible to reach it.
Thank you very much, Professor Zamagni. I think you already answered a part of the first question, so I'm grateful for that. I think in this discussion we have to try to be very clear, because we have a whole auditorium of teachers and students of all the fields of knowledge. So let's make this effort to try to be very clear in our language and in our explanations. So the first question that I want to put out there is for you is, what are the ways in which the humanities can positively influence other disciplines? Are the humanities a general theoretical framework or simply a support, or are they an integral part of the epistemology of the disciplines, even outside the humanities? Are they philosophically foundational to the questions, approaches, lessons, and other disciplines, or are they the complement to the specific approaches of those disciplines? If you want to give us some examples, that would be great. Thank you, Professor Schuck.
Thank you. I agree completely with the concern about the role of the humanities foundationally. I would like to talk about some of the practical things that I've observed standing in the middle of the natural sciences, social, and humanities. I've been thinking about this in preparation for the Congress, and I see 6 things that the humanities are absolutely essential for in the sciences. And they won't be a surprise to you, but I think just to state them, I think firstly, creativity. There's a way of seeing in the humanities that's absolutely necessary for the functioning of science. Maybe most dramatically displayed in physics. Secondly, hermeneutics. The skills of hermeneutics in the humanities, I think, absolutely necessary, even in maybe in an unstated and unconscious way in the scientific endeavor. Thirdly, empathic understanding. Max Weber talked about this as erklärendes Verstehen. So many biologists that I've talked to have this empathic understanding of nature. So many biologists I've asked, why are you in this field? And they'll say, well, my father took me fishing, or my family went to the mountains. There's an empathy absolutely necessary, I think, for the enterprise of science. Fourthly, critical thinking, obviously. I think fifthly, oral and communication skills, obviously. And I think sixthly, a historical understanding of these fields. Natural scientists are not always so concerned about the historical evolution of their fields, and that really makes a difference. And similarly with social science, I think the humanities retains that information about the historic genealogy of knowledge, right? Genealogy of ideas. Without these tools, these fundamental gifts of the humanities to the sciences, I think that activity would stop dead in its tracks at this very moment. So the question of the humanities as foundationally necessary through the philosophical reasoning, I think, is clear, but also the practice of these sciences and the dependence of these sciences on the humanities for their practice.
Thank you very much, Professor Schuck. Would you like to add something, Professor Zamagni?
Yes, thank you. Let me refer specifically to the case of economics. As you know, oikonomike was the name coined by Aristotle to denote the discipline that today is well known to everybody. But in the Greek language, oikonomike is an adjective, not a noun. And according to the Aristotelian philosophy, nouns refers to substances and adjective to accidents. So the question is, what was the substance to which the accident oikonomike was referring? The answer by Aristotle and many others after him was the polis. Polis, in the Greek sense, because oikonomike was supposed to help a community, a group of people, to obtain the good life. That was the definition. And this idea went on for many centuries, until the second scholastic, the Escuela de Salamanca, Salamanca School, St. Thomas, etc. The situation changed in one particular year, 1651, when the French Antoine de Montchrétien coined the expression économie politique, which was translated into English later in political economy. What happened? That oikonomike, who was an adjective, became a noun. And then the story changed completely. Because what was the idea behind that? That economics, which how it was called later by Marshall from Cambridge, because he said political economy is not very clear. It's better to call it economics with no other determination. Now, this fact determined a major change. Namely, economics started to separate itself from humanities. Humanities were considered as servant to economists. The economists used to serve themselves with humanities, but they were not integral part of the domain of the subject itself. Now, this was taken for granted. Even Adam Smith, great Adam Smith, believed that way. He was professor of moral philosophy in Scotland, and so he tried to cut a compromise, but still he maintained the idea that economics is a science separated from humanities. Now, the legitimization, so to speak, of this great division came in 1829. That is a tragedy, because most economists do not know these things. And that is a danger. Because in 1829, Richard Whately, who had the chair of economics in Oxford, and he was bishop of the Anglican Church, so a very influential person, made a famous speech in 1829 when he announced the principle of NOMA. NOMA is an acronym which means non-overlapping magisteria. And he said, if economics wants to be a science, it has to separate, to cut itself from both ethics and politics. Because economics has nothing to do neither with ethics nor with politics. That became the original sin of modern day economics, which does not mean that economists should not know philosophy, ethics, etc. But in their doing their job, in constructing theories, models, etc., they should not pay any attention to ethical discourse, because the division of labor was ethics is the kingdom of values, politics is the kingdom of ends, and economics is the kingdom of the means. And so the reductionism followed. Namely, economics is a mere technical science which provides the best means to obtain the ends fixed by politicians, by politics, under the supervision of the ethicists, etc. Now, what we have to be aware of the fact that nowadays means in the last couple of decades, this principle of NOMA is going to be discarded. But what is the problem? That still the economic profession is not aware of this. And so in our textbooks, we continue to teach old-fashioned economics. And in fact, the normal definition is, what is economics? Is the science that, given the scarcity of resources, finds the optimal or the best use of scarce means to reach certain ends. That is the definition provided by Lionel Robbins from the London School of Economics in the 30s or last century, which is ridiculous as a definition, because it makes no sense. But still, this is taught. Of course, there are exceptions. And in conclusion, what I think is that unless we modify the original sin, in other words, we give it up to the NOMA principle, there will be no real dialogue between a science such as economics, but the same, what I said, applies to sociology and also to certain branches of psychology and humanities. That is why, in my opinion, it's important to know these things, because unless we do not know the origin of certain deviation, if we so wish, we cannot modify the situation.
Thank you very much, Professor Zamagni. I find it very interesting and very compelling to make this effort so we can go to the original scenes of our own sciences to find out the place in history or the place in thought where the humanities and the sciences became two different things, two separate words. So I would like to ask first, Professor Schuck, if you find the same original sin in the biology field, in the environmental field of studies, and how do you think we can approach a dialogue here in university to solve this original sin?
I agree with this concept. I think that probably the first resolution of this original sin will be not so much a new idea as much as putting people together, as we are doing here. I would like to talk about three very practical ways in which this is being addressed in the United States. One is has been articulated in a 2018 study just last year by the National Association of Science, Technology, and Math, a study showing the absolute necessity of the humanities for the conduct of science, math, and technology. This study is available on the online. They use the phrase from Einstein, branches of the same tree. So out of this has been a movement to move from, if you're familiar with the nomenclature in the United States, from STEM to STEAM. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, yes, I'm sorry, and math. And so Princeton University is working on a curriculum that is STEAM, right? Science, technology, engineering, art and humanities, and mathematics. That's one practical example of something going on to try to bring people very pragmatically together to work on these, to resolve this original sin. A second example is what's called CBR, or community-based research, which you're probably familiar with. In community-based research, the humanities are absolutely necessary to help human beings narrate their stories, put their stories together in a community, articulate their needs. Sometimes the arts and photography are employed to do this community-based research. So when we get research out of the ivory tower into the community, lo and behold, the humanities become very necessary. A third thing that's going on, and maybe you have it here at Francisco Vitoria, but we have it at Marquette University and at Santa Clara, are what's called living learning communities. So students come and live together, say students interested in the environment, live together in a dorm or a dorm floor. And those students may be majors in science, they may be majors in philosophy or fine arts, but they have this shared interest in environment, and they began to address the original sin through their living together and talking together of their different interests. That's in environment. We have also in philosophy, we have a philosophy community. Those are the kind of practical things I think that are going on. Just some few examples where the humanities are being reinserted into the practice of higher education.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend this same exercise to Professor Zamagni. Do you think you could, I don't know, have you worked in any concrete project or initiative that can show us how humanities could have a central place in research, in thinking, and in thinking processes, maybe in economy?
Thank you. Yes, and in fact, it's always like that. Sometimes things happen without any planning in advance. In 1974, in America, Richard Esterlin, an American economist still alive, published an article which provoked an earthquake in our area. The article was about the so-called happiness paradox. Working with the American statistical data, what Esterlin found, and putting on the horizontal axis income per capita, and on the vertical axis the index of happiness, he found that the curve is like a parabola, first going up and then going down. That is the reason why it is called the happiness paradox. Paradox is a Greek word which means surprise, something. Because the idea, dominating until then, was that as your income goes up, you will become happier and happier. Now, he found that that is not true. That beyond a certain threshold, which in those days was quantified in $22,000 per capita per year, further increments of income, instead of increasing happiness, decreased it. How to explain? That is why it was called and today, all over the world, economists and non-economists know this. Because it's, from a certain point of view, a tragedy. Because the mistake was to confuse happiness with utility. And that is the major responsibility of economists. We have to admit, I belong to a profession which has major moral responsibility. Because we should stop teaching to students that in order to be happy and happier, you have to maximize your utility. It is obvious that if you increase your income, you increase the utility. But utility is something. Happiness is something else. Where is the difference? That utility is the property of the relation, as Aristotle already said, between a person and a thing. This water gives me utility, but not happiness. Happiness is the property of the relation between a person and another person. So nowadays, we are discovering that the major weak point of our theoretical construction is anthropological. It's not technical. It's not mathematical. I mean, today economists are highly consider econometrics. They use all quantitative method of analysis. But the mistake is the anthropology, to believe that a human being is more or less like a god, a dog, a cat, an animal. For an animal, there is no distinction between utility and happiness, but not for a human being. Because, as you know, eudaimonia, which is the word used by the Greek to mean happiness, has an important meaning. Eudaimonia means flourishing. We are happy when we flourish, when we realize our potential. On the other hand, we enjoy utility when we having resources, growing resources, we can afford buying that, etc. And that is why in recent times, the notion of relational goods had emerged. The notion of relational good, this expression in economics, was introduced by two economists, one Italian and one American, exactly in the same year. By mere chance, the two did not know each other, etc. The fact is that our happiness depends on the interpersonal relation that I establish with my neighbor or non-neighbor, etc. Of course, utility is not to be discarded because it's important. If I am hungry, I need food. That gives me utility. But happiness is much more. So the anthropological reductionism has played a very tremendous role in our discipline because it has prevented the economics to thinking in terms of flourishing or prosperity, and only. That is why we keep on being interested only in growth. Of course, growth is good, GDP. But can we reduce the whole humanity to the growth dimension? Of course not. And the fact that today the United Nations every year publish the World Happiness Index, 157 countries are listed, is revealing of the interest in the matter. Of course, there are many disputes on the way to measure. That is obvious, but that is not the point. The point is that today, to talk about happiness is not something that economists should leave to other disciplines. But they have to, because you see, unless people are able to realize their potential in the working place, first of all, you cannot go and work in a place where they pay you at the end of the month a good salary, but you are treated in a non-humane way. That is not tolerable, because you see, human beings are not only hungry, they need satisfaction of life. The same is true when we talk about family. The problem of the family is a problem very serious. You cannot say, from my point of view, if I am an entrepreneur, family does not exist. Exists only the individual worker. What does it mean? That is a stupid statement, because that individual worker, it's a member of a family. And so you cannot separate the two, etc. with me. In conclusion, the point is that we need, and I'm sure that we will reach it. Soon, I am perhaps a bit too much optimistic, but we have to change the anthropological premise, which is still the premise which says Homo economicus. Now, you know that Homo economicus is nothing but the translation in a different wording of the famous assumption by Thomas Hobbes, 1651, the year of publication of his important book, which says Homo homini lupus. Every man is a wolf against vis-a-vis another man. That is the tragedy of the story. Of course, economists, they do not dare to state Homo homini lupus. So they have invented the expression Homo economicus, which is exactly the same. And there is a scandal that these things are not taught. Because you see, people, in particular young people, need to know. Of course, you can also say that you love this assumption. Freedom. There is freedom, but you have to state it. Anytime we assume Homo economicus, implicitly we are assuming Homo homini lupus. Of course, there is the alternative, which says Homo homini natura amicus, which means every man is by nature a friend. Amicus is a friend of another man. So today, the battle within economics and social science, because the same applies to the other sciences, is exactly, do we want to continue with the Homo homini lupus assumption or with the other assumption? And the fact that today it is possible to talk in these terms, in my opinion, is a good sign. Is a good sign of the times, because until 20, 30 years ago, it was impossible to talk. That was I was fortunate to have been able to study in Oxford a long time ago, and I'm fortunate to have a professor, supervisors, who already anticipated in those days what today is current. And that is a sign which opens to, let's say, to the hope in a possibly near future change in the foundational. That is why at the beginning I said we need to re-establish a marriage, so to speak, after the big divorce between the humanities and sciences.
Thank you very much, Professor Zamagni. So we find that we have like these two great worlds. The first one is the world of sciences that have this thirst for another epistemological or another anthropological premise, a new anthropological premise, because they are seeing how their answers are not sufficient to their goals. And in the other hand, we have this humanities philosophical world of people who try to think profoundly about the great themes of humankind and of the truth. And before you told us something very interesting, Professor Schuck, about one of the main things that the humanities could give to sciences as creativity, as this new way of seeing things. I would love if you could expand a little more on that, because I think that maybe that's a very interesting point in this marriage that Professor Zamagni is trying to establish between these two worlds.
There are, I think, two amazing claims, repeated claims in Pope Francis's Laudato Si, and you're familiar with his phrase, everything is connected. And that's a very beautiful, classic kind of humanistic vision. There's a second phrase that is less commented on, but it's used a lot in Laudato Si, and there's a great insistence in the Pope for us to think deeply about it, and that phrase is, we are all related. So it's one thing to say that everything is connected. You can talk about that in terms of systems theory. But when we say we are all related, and the Pope wasn't just thinking about the relationship that we need to build between ourselves as humans, but the profound relationship we have with plants, the profound relationship that we have with animals, the profound relationship we have with the abiotic nature. This is very difficult for my students to grasp because we have fully objectified nature and commodified nature, so to talk about a relationship is very difficult, but this is the seeing that I think Pope Francis challenges us to engage in. And I spent several weeks at the, I don't know if you're familiar with the Standing Rock pipeline protest that took place in 2016 out in South Dakota. I spent a fair amount of time in a tent out there protesting the pipeline. And one evening, one of the Lakota elders got up around the fire and spoke to us and said, we are not here defending nature. We are nature defending itself. Now that is something that we can receive in our frontal cortex, but to really understand what that means, that we are nature defending itself, I think is very difficult for our students, and that's a seeing. To have that, if you're, I was talking earlier with someone about this. If you're familiar with Aldo Leopold, a famous American naturalist, talks about, he was a hunter and he saw the green fire die in the eyes of a wolf, and he said when, for the first time in his life, when he saw that green fire, he realized the wolf and the mountain did not agree with him. He felt he had that, what Francis would call an ecological conversion. He saw his fundamental relationship with nature, the subjectivity, if we are so bold to say, of nature. So that is a seeing that I think is critically important, that only the humanities can really bring to the sciences.
Thank you very much. Professor Zamagni, how can we see this same approach in the field of economics? How would you describe the contribution of the humanities to economics, or the processes of learning economics from this point of view, from the point of view of a new way of seeing things?
Thank you. In epistemology, philosophy of science, there is a thesis which is called the double hermeneutic thesis. Now, applying it to the field of economics, it runs as follows. Economic theories on the behavior of people, of human beings, tend to change the character and the behavior itself. In other words, economic theories are not mere neutral instrument of knowledge. If I am an astronomer and I observe the stars, I might be wrong or right on what I say. But even though I am wrong, the movement of the stars will not depend on my theory, because they will go ahead according to the natural law, etc. But the same is not true in social sciences. That is difficult to make people understand. Because let me give you the example. If I start from the assumption that you are wolves against me, homo homini lupus, what is the consequence? And I keep on teaching in the schools, in the publication, that everybody should be self-interested. Self-interested is not the same as selfishness. There are similarities, but it's better to say self-interest. The implication is that people listening to that, they will behave in their everyday life accordingly. For instance, they will not trust the others, and they will always suspect that the other will betray or exploit them. And so they have to erect fences, walls of separation. But why is that so? Because those people have been trained to the assumption that to be rational, you have to behave in a self-interest way. Self-interest means that I care only about my interest, whatever they are, irrespective of the interest of the other. So can we then be amazed why the ecology, climate change, environment has been destroyed? But why don't we consider that? The destruction environment started when the homo homini lupus entered into economics. Because then economists, they enjoy good reputation, and so they influence policymakers, politicians, and they pass the laws, and then at the end of the day, that is why Pope Francis in Laudato Si, there is a passage where he said so. He said, I claim the responsibility of those social scientists who for many decades tried to convince that nature is not part of the game. So when I make my calculations, talk to an entrepreneur and ask him or her, when you make the final balance sheet, do you include in your balance sheet the cost provoked by your activity cost in terms of environmental destruction? Of course not. So at the end of the year, you have profits. But why you have profits? Because you are not including the indirect cost. Indirect cost in terms of environmental destruction and many other examples. So all these are examples to indicate why the thesis of double hermeneutics is to be taken into consideration. In other words, when we explain a model or a theory, we should say that is not a neutral activity, because we are presupposing a value judgment, which in this case, it's a judgment considering the nature of human being. From that assumption follows certain consequence recipes, which are taken by entrepreneurs, policymakers, and that is why we are observing something in recent times change, and that is positive. You have seen, less than a month ago in America, the 181 CEOs, chief executive officers, of the most important corporation in the world, Amazon, JP Morgan, 800, they have signed a statement. I'm sure that at least you have heard about it, where they say we should stop behaving as we have done so far. It is not true that the ultimate purpose of the firm is profit maximization for the shareholder. And they went on with other things. Now, the same things were written in the encyclicals of the social doctrine of the Church in the last 40 years. But when the same things were said by the popes, people said, oh, that is irrelevant. That is just because the popes do not understand the logic of economics. Now that today the same things, even more, are subscribed by the top CEOs, you understand the implication. People are saying, perhaps that is another example to mean how humanities are important to our endeavor. Because the popes are not economists, of course, and they should not be economists. But the fact that they pose a question, sooner or later, change the situation. And that is why the responsibility of both teaching and researching in the area of social sciences is particularly relevant today. Because economists do not teach technicalities. Of course, there is a technical dimension, which is important, which is useful, but is an instrument. The economics should go to the oikonomike of Aristotle. In other words, should be considered for a purpose. You cannot say the purpose of economics is itself. That is a self-referential behavior which cannot be tolerated. And that is why it is important to talk in these terms in places like this and many others. Because until recently, there was separation. And separation always generates disasters, always. When you separate the mankind from the nature, when you separate a husband from a wife, the family destroys. There are many forms of separation. You have never seen something good coming out of separation. Autonomy is important, but autonomy is different from separation. Of course, economics is autonomous, but autonomous does not mean separated. That is what I tried to say at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Professor Zamagni. We have two last questions, and then we will have some time for questions and answers from the auditorium. Okay, so how can we try to reach not only professors, but also administrators who don't see the university as the space you are describing, this space of dialogue, but just as businesses? How can we show them the importance of this way of seeing? Professor Schuck?
I agreed with everything that you said except your portrayal of the wolf. Our students are in a double irony. One of the ironic features of our students' lives is that while our universities continue to narrow the focus of research and fragment knowledge. Employers want employees who can look at whole features of life and integrate. So I think at least at one level, administrators should wake up to this disconnect between what employers are looking for and the kind of studies we are engaging in with this continual fragmentation. The humanities and those soft skills are highly valued, and you know this, highly valued in the marketplace. The second irony, I think, is that unlike myself, and maybe unlike many of you, our students will have many jobs in their lives. My students, they'll also have probably more than one career. You know, I've had one career as a professor. I think that's going to become increasingly unusual with the change in economics. So the humanistic skills of being able to find one's integrity and have the communication skills and the imagination skills are going to be absolutely necessary for our students who are not going to likely find careers that will take them through the entirety of their lives. Our administrators need to understand that.
Thank you very much, Professor Zamagni. Would you like to add something to this question? Would you like to add something?
No, thank you, yes. In 1968, on the Harvard Business Review, which still is the top magazine in the business area, was published an article by Albert Carr, C-A-R-R, from Chicago. He was a pupil of Milton Friedman, the famous Nobel Prize winner. Now, the title of that article is revealing. You know what was the title? I quote you. Is business bluffing ethical? Question mark. And the answer provided in that article by Albert Carr is yes, because the rule of ethics to be applied to the business world, in particular to the financial part of the business world, should not be the same as the ethical rules which we are going to apply in other areas of mankind, such as family, real side of the economy, etc. Why is that so? Because the business game, he says, I quote almost by heart, is to be assimilated to a poker game. In a poker game, no one of the players has a reason to speak the truth to the others. Because if I want to win the game, I have to cheat you. What does it mean, cheat you? I have to make you believe that I have in my hands a card which does not correspond to reality. The same is true in financial and also business. In other words, if we want to maximize profits at any cost, as Milton Friedman had written in his famous book 1962, At Any Cost, we have to cheat the others. Conclusion, cheating in the business area, and in particular finance area, is to be considered ethical. Now, you should know that this article, which is almost never quoted, because most people, most economists are ashamed, but they never quote instead of telling to the students, putting in the reading list, because everybody has to have access to truth. Then you can even say that you agree with that thesis. Okay, freedom, complete freedom, but you should know. I cannot hide to my students what was considered sort of a Bible, because the Carr argument, which was supported by another article by Ladd, John Ladd, 2 years later, in 1970. If you read that article, you wouldn't possibly believe, but it was. And the content of those articles entered into the textbooks. and probably with different wording. They did not use poker game, but disaster is the same. Now, this is can we be amazed if 10 years, 11 years ago, we had the major financial crisis in modernity? I am referring to 2007, 2008. Of course, that was to be expected. Because if you base the financial game on that premises, what happened is a normal consequence. So that is important that we make this, when we know from philosophy or humanities that speaking, the search of truth is the major ultimate goal of any science. So you cannot hide the truth only to serve a certain purpose. In my opinion, that was done, so to speak, not because there were specific interests, but for lack of knowledge in particular, of moral philosophy. So that is why today we observe that in the teaching of economics, moral philosophy should be, but not aside. That is the terrible mistake. That we have university where economics is taught according to the car ladder model. Then on a side, there is a course on ethics. No, that doesn't work. You have to introduce ethics inside economics, not aside. Because the students, we were students, they consider that the first course is the important and they study it. The other one, the course on ethics, they read something, they pass the exam, etc. No, that is not fair. Now, as you know, perhaps, on May 14, next year, May 14, Pope Francis has decided, because he's a very fancy pope, this one, has decided to convene in Rome a major gathering of top people in different areas, universities, political life, etc., to talk about one problem, global pact on education. In other words, he hoped to get the signatures to a final declaration to exactly take a position on that. Because he said, the Pope says, in our university are schizophrenic, because inside the same university you have courses based on certain assumption, anthropological assumption, philosophical assumption, and courses based on opposite. And so it's not possible. That is schizophrenia. You cannot, because put yourself in the position of a student. He listens from one discourse. When he enters another course, opposite. So that is not education. That is only instruction. That is only formation. Education is much more. So that is why I am, as I said at the beginning, moderately optimistic, because things are changing. Are changing not because the Pope says so. No. Because people, real scientists, honest scientists, they are considering, I am referring to the top Nobel Prize winners in economics. I can give you the references. They said we should not continue this way because we are deteriorating our discipline, but above all, we are destroying the environment. We are increasing inequalities. Inequalities are increasing year after year, you should know, while wealth is increasing. And that is a paradox. Because how can you explain the fact that the global wealth is growing, increasing, and at the same time inequalities are increasing more than in proportion? That means that there must be something wrong. It said, third, considering what I mentioned before, the level of happiness are decreasing. Look at the data about the rate of suicides. Why the rate of suicides are increasing? But they are increasing not in the poor countries, because poor people never commit suicide, because a poor person entertains the hope that the future will be better than the present. Those who commit suicide are those people who have no reason, they have lost the sense of living. But that is a serious problem. can we say, oh, that is not a part of our duty because that leave it to religious people or to... that is ridiculous. That is a lack really of real knowledge, etc. And with many other examples we can be made. And that is why it is important that we take recognition of that and taking action, which are already this action moving the first steps, in my opinion, in the proper direction. The same is the same. How do you explain the fact that the religious dimension today is getting ground and citizenship right within social sciences, in a time when everybody believed that religion had nothing to do with the social sciences. And that is a sign of which I, hail positively with interest.
Thank you. I agree with most of what you were saying, except I have to make one insertion. I was in India in January, and thousands of poor Indian farmers have committed suicide because of their indebtedness to major agribusiness firms. So there is areas in the world where poor people are committing suicide in rather tragic numbers.
Well, thank you very much. With this last statement, we can maybe put the focus in the social impact of humanities in relation with other fields of knowledge. So our last question before going to the questions and answers from our audience will be, by adding an essential anthropological dimension and giving the elements of the respective disciplines historical, philosophical, spiritual, and aesthetic depth, do the humanities modify the social impact of those disciplines? Do they integrate them more to the world and its dynamics?
I think that my answer to that would be obvious to you after what I've said. So I'm going to leave that aside, but I do want to ask you a question that I know that we probably won't have time to pursue it very long here, but if you want to share your answer with me personally. As you well know, we are undergoing a tragic kind of rise of populist authoritarianism in the United States. We have a rise in violence in synagogues. We have a rise in violence against African Americans. We have a political crisis on our hands, and we're not alone in that. We know that populist authoritarianism is elsewhere in the world. I just wonder if the fragmentation of knowledge in our educational system is not in part implicated in this development. The lack, I'm looking at our curricular organizations of our public school curriculum in the United States. Many people are looking at this to see if the excision of the humanities, the reduction of humanities that's taken place in the last 20 years may in some way, and then this may be a stretch, it may be in some way implicated in this really tragic rise of populist authoritarianism. I just wonder if any of you have an opinion on that, and if you do, I'd appreciate you sharing that with me.
Thank you very much. Well, with this, maybe we could have a few minutes for questions and answers from the audience. So, is there any question? We have one here, down here. We have two. Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I love what you both contributed, and I particularly warm to Stefano, to what you've been talking about on the death of economic man. Our next door neighbour at Oxford, Sir Paul Collier, has got an article coming out shortly with the title On the Death of Economic Man, which he lists a lot of the economists who are probably in your mind when you're saying that, and I'm sure it's right. And there's quite a strong movement in Oxford with him and Colin Mayer promoting this. And as you say, economic theories make a difference. I wondered if I could just challenge one of the other assertions that you made, though, which is that if within a university you have strongly different views or different underpinning theories, that is instruction, not education, and that you should have a homogeneity of underpinning values. Because I wonder if there's a case actually for the opposite position, that is to say, what we long for our students to do is to be exposed to conflicting, incompatible views articulately expressed by great scholars, through which they have to navigate their own way and thereby learn lifelong skills. And indeed, since the education, university education I've been involved with has been in the sciences, there's actually rather little scope for that in the sciences. If you're teaching people quantum theory, there's not a lot of scope for giving them rival quantum theories and saying you sort it out between them, because we're pretty much agreed on quantum theory. Of course, in philosophy, there's scope for different interpretations. That doesn't affect most scientists as they do their science. Whereas in the humanities, this is the absolute foundation of what they're being taught. And in the Oxford tutorial system, they'll be asked to read, 5 incompatible books by great scholars on a topic and then write an essay which they then have to defend to their tutor. And if they do that every week for 3 years, they gain some critical faculties and intellectual skills, which all being well will last them a lifetime, and give them the ability to discern when someone is talking nonsense.
May I respond? It was. Okay.
Of course, Michael, please do.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, your question is, of course, very relevant and very well taken. Let me, to be brief, answer this way. I didn't mention, as you correctly said, the recent developments in the, let me mention behavioral economics. In fact, I didn't say many other things for lack of time. But the point that you raised, it's important. Pluralism is my answer. In other words, the word itself, university, comes from Latin, universitas. In other words, the tendency towards the unity of knowledge. The tendency is like climbing a mountain. You can climb from the north, from the south side, etc. So that is why we should avoid the idea of mainstream. In other words, a thought which becomes the unique thought to be imposed to the student. That is today not tolerable. And the students react, as we know, if you pay attention around the world, because they tell. We should know that Taylorism, which, as you know, Taylor published his book in 1911 in the United States, and he was the inventor of the assembly line, and is the one who made the Americans number one in the world in terms of productivity, because Taylorism increased productivities enormously. But what was the basic principle of Taylorism? The vertical principle, hierarchy. The one on top, they state the line, the other have to follow suit, etc. Now, this idea of Taylorism has entered also inside our universities in a disguised way. We have to change it. And in fact, in America today, the major universities are changing the method. They talk about cooperative learning, which is thus the opposite to the Tayloristic model, according to which there is one in the chair who teaches, and the other ones are supposed to repeat what. That is not possible today. Unless the one in the chair is a semi-god, it is obvious that's so that is why we have to incentivize horizontal link among the students and professors. In other words, we have to resurrect the idea of community. If you read the book by Cardinal Newman, which is a fascinating book, the idea of university, already more than a century ago, he anticipated what is occurring today. We have to reestablish a community made up of students, professors, administrators, etc., instead of, in the name of efficiency, impose a unique model, etc. Because efficiency is certainly important, it's a value, but it's not the ultimate value, because efficiency belongs to the realm of means, not to the realms of ends. We have always to ask ourselves, we are supposed to be efficient, what for? At the very moment you put the question in this way, you understand that certain methods which are acclaimed as most efficient are not tolerable, etc. So there are modifications, and the idea of education has to go back to the origin of the word. Education comes from Latin, educere. Educere in Latin means taking out of the mind of the students in order to help him or her to into himself or herself into the total reality. On the other hand, the instruction is just the opposite. Instruction means putting in. Education means pulling out, just to use a sort of a metaphor. And then it is time to move from instruction, which should continue. We should continue to perfectionate the method of instruction, no doubt, but not only that, because in particular the young people of today, the present generation, the so-called native digital, they need more than in the past an educational approach, because they know technicalities much better than we so-called migrant digital. I am very old, and so I am very more migrant. But so it's useless to teach them, because they learn them by themselves. What they need is to be helped to make sense of what they are using and what they will use in the future. And that is why is the role at the end of education, which should go hand to hand with instruction. And just to conclude with the metaphor by Platon. Platon is Spanish. Plato in Phaedrus writes the following. He says, il solco will be straight and the crop abundant if the two horses which pull the plow march with the same velocity. It's fantastic, this idea. In the old Greece, the plow was trained not by the oxes as in this part of the world, but by horses. Because if one horse goes faster than the other, the plow goes in one direction or the other, and there is no crop. Here is the same. We need to rebalance instruction and education, because instruction will continue to be fundamental under the condition that it will not crowd out education. And that is what we have been doing in the last 50, 60 years, following a certain method set, certainly the famous book by the famous pedagogist who says the end of education. Because today many people write about the end of history, the end of education, the end of everything. But in my opinion, there is no end at all. But we have to rebalance, putting in equilibrium, so to speak, the two elements, making the life of our university still fundamental as it was to do.
I jumped in before you had your chance to answer, but your comment made me just realize that the social media has changed so radically the experience of my students. I can't even begin to enter into that reality because it wasn't mine as a student. So the community of knowledge, I think that Doctor is talking about, is so critical, but I would add to that I think our students want to see that teachers are living what they teach. I think we're on a model historically of, well, I teach, I'm a hair doctor professor, and then I live something that may not be necessarily connected with what I teach. My students see that. And one of the things that I think attracts them so much to Pope Francis, my students frankly have lost much interest in organized religion, but they are interested in spirituality. They are interested in Pope Francis because he looks like a man who lives what he teaches. And in a world of social media chaos, to be able to trust, it becomes a personal engagement in the pedagogy.
Estaba antes un señor.
Thanks very much to both of the panelists. I have a question for each of you. First, Professor Zamagni, first of all, I just want to say how wonderful it is to hear such a learned economist, one who knows the humanistic tradition, who knows about history, knows about philosophy, and so forth. You're in the tradition of Amintore Fanfani. I hope that's a complimentary thing to say. An early 20th century Italian statesman and economist who I admire very much, and also Albert Hirschman, an exception among American economists for that kind of learning, which leads to my question for you. When I listen to you talk, and also you invoking the example of the article from Call and Ludd, Milton Friedman, and so forth, the economists I know in the United States don't talk like you do. They don't sound at all like you do, with few exceptions. And so I wonder if you could comment about whether you see the kinds of reasons for optimism, this is changing, there's a new paradigm, and so forth, as being primarily among colleagues on this side of the Atlantic. We'll throw in Oxford, at least some of them that Andrew was just talking about a moment ago, and say less at the University of Chicago School of Economics, which still dominates in the United States. That's my question for you. For Professor Schuck, to the question about whether it has been, and this is more my offering of an answer to your question about whether it's been something about the changes in American school curricula that has somehow brought out this populism disaster and so forth. I'm not the only person to suggest that it's actually one of the culprits is the humanities themselves in the United States and elsewhere, and particularly the extent to which between the 1970s and 90s postmodernism / post-structuralism in one way or another affected so many humanistic disciplines. And the colleagues who thought it was really epistemologically clever to talk about how the Foucauldian influence on this and the Derridian notion of that and so forth, right, subverted the paradigm of epistemological realism and so forth, didn't think it was so funny when the listeners and watchers of Fox News said, well, I'm just gonna listen to what I wanna listen to. You have your truth, right? You have your truth and I have mine. And that has been a catastrophic development, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. And it's the humanities, not all humanists, but many humanists who indirectly contributed to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. What you said is correct, but I'm sure that you are aware of the fact that in the last 10, 15, 20 years, the situation has changed. Let me quote you an economist, an American economist like Danny Roderick. At the beginning of this year, he is the coordinator of a group of economists. They are 70. American, all of them American. They have created an association which is called Economists for Inclusive Prosperity. If you read the manifesto, which was published at the end of last January, you understand why we should be more optimistic than we used. Because they say we should stop with the paradigm which we have inherited from the past century. Because that paradigm is not that it is wrong from a technical point of view. No, because they are mathematically oriented perfectly, but it's wrong from an anthropological point of view. When you read these things from top 70 economists, Americans, you start considering that situation is changing. Second, consider people like Stiglitz, people like Akerlof, people like Amartya Sen. I quote Nobel Prize winners on purpose, and so on. And they are already, I wouldn't say majority, but they say we should redirect economics as a discipline, but not redirect from a technical point of view. Because from a technical point of view, everything is good, everything is perfect, but from a philosophical point of view. And that is second, it's you find said why we have reason to be optimistic. Because at the end of the day, we live for happiness. Because the purpose of our life is happiness. You can define different way, but you will never find a person who says, I do not want to be happy. You can find people who says, I do not want to have a lot of money. Yeah. But everybody wants it. Even St. Francis, he got rid of his riches for being happy. So when you touch that is particularly important for the young people. Young people, they know what this means. When they realize that a certain mode of thinking and behavior prevents the achievement of happiness, they change. Because, you see, of course, that is a metaphysical assumption. But I think that it's a good assumption, namely to believe that we do want to increase our flourishing and our possibility.
Yes, thank you. I think that's very, very true. I guess I take nihilistic humanism as an oxymoron, and I take materialistic humanism as nonsensical. So when I think about humanism, I'm thinking about an embodied humanism in the traditional sense, not in the deconstructive project. But I think you're absolutely right, historically, what's going on, yeah.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last question. Okay.
Thanks to both of you for your comments. My question goes more to Dr. Zamagni, although I'd welcome comments from Dr. Schuck as well. You mentioned in one of your minor statements the double phenomenon of the increase of wealth, global increase of wealth, and increase of disproportionality. And we don't need examples of either of those things, I believe. But I think some would take issue with the statement that something is wrong, saying that, well, if the global threshold is rising, then something is also right. So I was wondering if from the point of view of economics as that which leads to human flourishing in society, that which allows society to reach, to attain the good life, if you could comment on the criteria of disproportionality, what constitutes that disproportionality, why is it harmful, and what is going wrong?
Esta no es una pregunta, es el tema por un congreso. No, pero muchas gracias. Thank you for having thank you for having posed the question. Now we know what are the basic and fundamental reasons why in the last 50 years inequality is increased. We know. The literature is unanimous of that. The libraries are full of books describing that. Even the last 2 or 3 books, Ravalion, the famous one, the elephant curve, etc. What is the problem is not to know the phenomenon and to describe it, but which measure should be taken in order to overcome. And there, when you come at that point, you have to leave the realm of pure economics in the sense that I have criticized, and you have to face humanities. In other words, that is the trick. When you talk on technicalities, of course, people will say to you, what's the point of introducing ethical dimension, etc. But when you say, okay, for the description, it's good, that reasoning. But how to cope with that? Yeah. And in that point, you have to consider that inequalities have major consequences. One is it's a threat to democracy. Why today we have populism? We have populism is the major component of populism is inequalities. Because when, be careful, don't confuse inequalities with poverty. Poverty is declining, and that is good, but inequality is increasing. And most people, it's always our fault, because we never clear the difference between poverty and inequality. Poverty is somebody who has nothing to eat. To be specific, less than $1.90 per day to spend. That is the definition of the United Nations. In other words, somebody who is almost starving or undernourished. Inequality means that the chances of life of certain social groups go and increase the distance with the other one. And that is the issue. When you come to that point, you have to introduce the notion of liberty, the dignity, human dignity, which are notions which have nothing to do with the assumption of homo economicus.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we have to end this discussion. We are out of time. Please join me in thanking our two guests, and let's go to have lunch.